If you'd asked me 5 years ago what the biggest problem in my life would be, I probably would have said rising property taxes, maybe replacing the old dock after another brutal winter. I never would have guessed it'd be a man in an HOA polo shirt who believed the shoreline behind my house belonged to whoever could make the most money from it. Looking back now, the part that still keeps me awake isn't even the money he made. It's how close people came to paying for his greed with something you can't replace. My name is Ethan Brooks. I'm 53 years old, and for most of my career I've worked as an environmental compliance consultant, which is a fancy way of saying companies usually called me after somebody had already made an expensive mistake. A few years ago, my wife, Claire, and I finally bought the lake house we dreamed about for almost 20 years, tucked away on a quiet little lake in northern Wisconsin, where mornings started with fog drifting across the water and evenings ended with loons calling somewhere out beyond the reeds. There were only a few dozen homes around the shoreline, most owned by retirees or families who'd been coming there for generations. It felt like the kind of place where everyone waved, everyone borrowed each other's ladders, and nobody bothered locking the shed. I like that. After spending decades dealing with regulations and industrial sites, peace was worth more than square footage. We own one of the nicest stretches of shoreline, not because it was fancy, but because it was flat enough for kids to swim and old enough to have huge oak trees throwing shade over the dock all afternoon. If neighbors wanted to fish from my dock while I was away, I didn't mind. If somebody's grandchildren wanted to jump off the end of it for an hour, I'd usually tell them to have fun and just be careful. That's how communities are supposed to work. You help people because someday they'll help you back. At least that's what I believed. Then there was Richard Hale. Every neighborhood has somebody who mistakes authority for ownership, and Richard had been collecting HOA titles like they were trophies. Treasurer, budget committee chairman, maintenance coordinator. If there was a clipboard involved, Richard somehow ended up holding it. The funny thing was he wasn't openly rude. Not at first. He smiled constantly, shook hands a little too hard, remembered everyone's first name, and somehow always managed to make every conversation circle back to how much work he did for the community. Claire used to whisper after meetings, "He's campaigning for an election nobody's holding." We'd laugh, climb into the truck, and forget about him. At least we tried to. One afternoon, he wandered over while I was replacing a loose board on the dock. He watched for a minute with his hands in his pockets before saying, "You've got the best access point on the lake." I shrugged. Guess we got lucky. He smiled in a way that didn't quite reach his eyes. Lucky things usually end up benefiting everybody. At the time, I figured he was talking about letting neighbors fish now and then. Looking back, I realized he was already measuring what he thought he could take. That summer, Claire and I spent several weeks helping our daughter move across the state. We weren't at the lake much, maybe weekends here and there. Every time we returned, there seemed to be more unfamiliar cars parked nearby. I assumed relatives were visiting neighbors. It was vacation season, after all. Then one Saturday morning, I turned onto our gravel driveway and nearly slammed on the brakes. SUVs, pickup trucks, boat trailers, jet skis, folding chairs, coolers, kids running across my lawn like it was a public park. I counted more than 30 people before I even got out of the truck. Claire looked at me and quietly asked, "Did we miss some neighborhood event?" I honestly thought maybe somebody had suffered an emergency and everyone had gathered to help. That illusion lasted about 10 seconds. A man carrying a fishing rod walked right past me and said, "Morning. Richard told us the rental starts at 9. I blinked. "Rental?" He nodded like I'd asked what color the sky was. "Yeah, the lakeside package." Then he walked away before I could ask another question. I stood there hearing laughter echo across my own property while strangers unloaded picnic baskets onto my grass. A little girl asked her father if they could use the owner's dock, and he answered, "That's what we paid for." Paid who? That question hit me like a cold wave. Claire could already tell something was wrong because she knows the difference between me being confused and me being angry. I wasn't angry yet, not really. Mostly I was trying to convince myself there had to be some misunderstanding. Richard wouldn't actually rent out someone else's property, would he? I found him 20 minutes later chatting with two families near the boat launch like he was hosting a resort. He looked over, smiled broadly, and waved. "Ethan, glad you made it back." I walked over slowly and asked the simplest question I could think of. "Why are people telling me they rented my shoreline?" His smile faded for only a second before returning. "Well, I wouldn't put it exactly like that." "Then how would you put it?" He folded his arms. Community Recreation Initiative. I stared at him, honestly waiting for the punchline. It never came. Instead, he started explaining how he'd been maximizing underused amenities for the benefit of the neighborhood. Underused amenities. That's what he called my land, my dock, my insurance, my liability. Before I could even respond, another RV rolled into the neighborhood. And that's when I noticed something that made every instinct I'd developed over 30 years in environmental work come screaming to the surface. A gray hose hung beneath the vehicle, dripping steadily onto the ground only a few yards from the edge of the lake. I didn't know it yet, but that single hose was about to change everything. For most people, that little gray hose probably would have looked like nothing more than another camping setup. But after 3 decades of inspecting industrial sites and contaminated properties, I knew exactly what I was looking at, and I also knew exactly how ugly things could become if nobody stopped it. I walked over before the driver even finished backing into the space. "Hey," I called out, trying to keep my voice calm. "Where does that drain line go?" The man looked surprised. "Richard said it was fine. Said everybody empties gray water here." I felt my stomach tighten. "No," I said quietly. "Nobody empties gray water into a freshwater lake." He glanced toward Richard, who was laughing with another group 20 yards away, then back at me. "That's not what we were told." I didn't yell. There wasn't any point. These families weren't the villains. They'd paid for what they believed was a legitimate weekend on a private lake. The real problem was standing over by the picnic tables, acting like a cruise director. Richard saw me walking toward him and actually smiled. "Everything okay?" he asked. "No," I answered. "Tell every RV here to stop discharging anything immediately." He laughed. Actually laughed. "Come on, Ethan. It's just sink water. You don't know that. You're overreacting." "Am I?" I stepped closer. "Because if one black tank gets dumped into this lake, you're not talking about a neighborhood problem anymore." He shrugged. "Nobody's going to know." That sentence stayed with me. Nobody's going to know. It wasn't ignorance. It wasn't a mistake. It was calculation. I went home without saying another word because arguing with someone who already believed he was untouchable would have accomplished nothing. Instead, I did what I'd spent my career teaching companies to do: document everything. I pulled security footage from the cameras facing the shoreline. I downloaded timestamps. I photographed every vehicle. I recorded the advertisements I found online promoting exclusive lakefront access. There they were, smiling families, professionally edited pictures of my dock, my shoreline, even the swing Claire and I had built beneath the old oak tree. Richard had listed weekend recreation packages, premium dock access, kayak launches, picnic privileges, and nowhere did he mention asking permission from the people who actually owned the property. Claire sat beside me while I built folder after folder on my laptop. "Do you think he realizes how serious this is?" she asked. I looked at another photo showing foam collecting along the water's edge. "Honestly," I replied, "I think he thinks he's too clever to get caught." Monday morning, I called the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources. The woman who answered transferred me to an environmental investigator after I explained what I'd documented. He listened quietly while I described the rental operation, the unauthorized commercial activity, the wastewater discharge, and the footage I'd collected. When I finished, he asked one question. "Can you send everything today?" "Already uploading." 2 days later, inspectors arrived without announcing themselves. Richard apparently assumed they were tourists because he walked right over wearing his usual grin. I watched from my porch as one inspector introduced himself. The smile disappeared from Richard's face almost immediately. Water samples were taken from multiple locations. Soil around the RV parking area was collected. They photographed hoses, runoff channels, algae forming near the shoreline, and several families standing ankle-deep in water that suddenly didn't look nearly as inviting as it had the week before. Richard spent nearly an hour following them around, insisting everything was being exaggerated. One inspector finally turned toward him and said, "Sir, I'd recommend you stop talking until we finish collecting evidence." Even from a distance, I could tell Richard wasn't used to hearing the word no. 3 days passed, then 4. The lake looked strangely peaceful again, but something about it had changed. The water near my dock had lost that crystal-clear look we'd loved since buying the property. Thin green streaks drifted across the surface. Fish weren't jumping anymore. Birds seemed to avoid the shallows. Claire noticed it first one evening while we were sitting outside. "Does it smell different?" she asked. I inhaled slowly. She was right. There was a faint sour odor hanging over the shoreline. Not overwhelming. Just enough that once you noticed it, you couldn't ignore it anymore. Friday afternoon, my phone rang. The investigator's voice sounded much more serious than before. Elevated bacterial levels. Nutrient contamination. Indicators consistent with improper wastewater discharge. He couldn't discuss every detail yet because additional testing was underway, but he strongly suggested we avoid recreational use of the water until further notice. I thanked him, hung up, and just sat there looking out across the lake. Claire didn't even ask. She could tell by my face. "It's bad," she whispered. I nodded. "Worse than I hoped." Unfortunately, the numbers weren't the end of it. The following weekend, the first call started circulating through the neighborhood. A little boy developed severe stomach cramps after swimming. Then another family mentioned both of their daughters had been vomiting since Sunday night. By Tuesday, everyone knew somebody who'd gotten sick. Some blamed food poisoning. Others blamed a stomach virus. Then the local urgent care physician started asking every patient the same question. "Have you been swimming in the lake recently?" Within 48 hours, the answer connected every case. 11 people. Adults and children. Dehydration. Gastrointestinal infections. High fevers. 3 kids admitted to the hospital for intravenous fluids. Watching ambulances pull into a neighborhood that normally argued about lawn height instead of emergency medicine was surreal. The atmosphere changed overnight. Parents who'd spent years letting their children run barefoot across the shoreline suddenly refused to let them touch the water. Grandparents canceled family gatherings. Boats stayed tied to docks. Conversations became whispers. Richard still tried to control the narrative. He knocked on doors telling people there wasn't enough evidence to blame the lake. He claimed outside investigators were overreaching. He even suggested somebody might be trying to damage property values before buying homes cheaply. When Claire told me that rumor, I actually laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was desperate. The truth didn't need rumors anymore. It already had laboratory reports. Monday morning, another government vehicle arrived, followed by 2 more. Additional agencies had become involved. Yellow equipment cases appeared along the shoreline. Survey markers were placed near drainage paths. This wasn't just an HOA disagreement anymore. It had become an environmental enforcement case. Richard spotted me while I was checking my mailbox and stormed across the street. "Happy now?" he snapped. "You brought the government into our neighborhood." I looked at him for a moment before answering. "No, Richard," I said quietly. "You did. I just made the phone call." He stepped closer, his face red with frustration. "You're ruining this community." I shook my head. The community can recover from bad publicity. Children don't always recover from contaminated water. For the first time since all of this started, he didn't have a comeback. He simply stared at me, turned around, and walked away. 2 days later, bright warning signs appeared around the shoreline advising residents to stay out of the water pending further environmental assessment. The peaceful little lake where Claire and I had planned to spend our retirement suddenly looked like the scene of a crime. And deep down, I knew the hardest conversations hadn't even started yet. By the end of that week, the lake barely resembled the place Claire and I had fallen in love with. Bright warning signs stood where children used to leave their bicycles. Yellow tape fluttered in the breeze near the public access points. And every conversation in the neighborhood seemed to begin with the same question. "Did you hear what happened now?" The official closure order came the following morning. No swimming, no boating, no fishing, no recreational access until the environmental cleanup was completed and the water passed every required test. 90 days. 3 full months. Richard didn't knock on my door this time. Instead, the HOA called an emergency meeting at the clubhouse, and for the first time since we'd moved there, every chair was filled. Nobody was chatting about flower beds or next month's barbecue. Parents looked exhausted. Retirees looked worried. The mood in the room felt heavy, like everyone had finally realized this wasn't an argument over property lines anymore. It was about trust. Richard stood at the front of the room with a stack of papers in his hands, trying to sound confident. "We've all suffered because of unnecessary outside interference," he began. Before he could continue, one of the mothers whose son had spent 2 nights in the hospital stood up. "Outside interference?" she asked, her voice trembling. "My little boy couldn't keep water down for 2 days." The room fell silent. Richard glanced away instead of answering. Another homeowner spoke up. "Did you rent out private property without permission?" Richard cleared his throat. "The community benefited financially. That's not what I asked. He shifted uncomfortably. Certain decisions were made in good faith. I had no intention of speaking that afternoon. Honestly, I would have been perfectly happy letting the investigation speak for itself. But when Richard looked across the room and pointed directly at me, saying, "If Ethan hadn't overreacted, none of this would have happened," I realized silence was no longer helping anyone. I walked to the front carrying a small folder, set it on the table, and quietly spread out photographs, printed advertisements, time-stamped security images, and copies of inspection notices. Then I placed one final document on top, the laboratory summary confirming contamination levels. "You keep saying this started with a phone call," I said calmly. It didn't. It started the day someone decided making a little extra money mattered more than protecting the people who trusted him. Nobody applauded. Nobody cheered. Real life usually isn't like the movies. People simply looked down at the evidence, then slowly back at Richard. One by one, the questions became harder, and his answers became shorter. Within 20 minutes, he quietly gathered his papers, muttered something about consulting an attorney, and walked out the side door without looking back. He resigned from the HOA the next morning. Over the next several weeks, civil claims began piling up. Families sought reimbursement for medical expenses, legal notices arrived almost weekly, and the rental operation disappeared from every website where it had once been advertised. Not long afterward, Richard listed his house for sale. According to one of the real estate agents in the neighborhood, he accepted an offer well below what similar homes had been selling for only months earlier. I never celebrated that. Losing money wasn't the lesson. Losing the community's respect was. The cleanup crews worked steadily throughout the summer. Water quality slowly improved, fish returned, and the familiar smell of fresh lake water eventually replaced the unpleasant odor we'd all grown to dread. Then something happened I honestly never expected. The new HOA board requested a meeting with Claire and me. There were no raised voices this time, no accusations, no speeches about authority. Just a simple apology. The newly elected president looked at me and said, "We spent so much time assuming goodwill would always be there that we forgot it actually belongs to someone." They explained that without legal access across my section of shoreline, many of the neighborhood activities they'd enjoyed for years simply couldn't continue. Then he asked if I'd consider working out an agreement. I thought about it for several days. Claire asked whether I was worried people might think we were taking advantage of the situation. I smiled and said no. I just want clear rules this time. So we drafted a formal access agreement. Everything was written down. Maintenance responsibilities, environmental standards, insurance requirements, security deposits for potential damage, automatic suspension if anyone violated state environmental regulations. No assumptions, no handshake promises, just accountability. They signed without asking for a single change. Looking back now, I don't think the biggest victory was the agreement or the restored lake. It was watching the neighborhood slowly become a community again. Parents let their kids fish from the dock once the water was declared safe. Neighbors started talking to each other instead of whispering behind closed curtains. Even the annual summer picnic eventually returned. Although this time everyone laughed when somebody joked that the only thing allowed anywhere near the water was lemonade. Every once in a while, someone asks whether I regret making that first phone call. My answer is always the same. I didn't close the lake. I didn't contaminate the water. I didn't put families at risk. I simply refused to pretend I hadn't seen what was happening. Sometimes doing the right thing doesn't make you popular in the moment, but popularity was never the point. Responsibility was. And maybe that's the hardest lesson communities ever have to learn. So now I'm curious what you think. If you discovered someone in your own neighborhood was risking everyone's health for profit, would you have reported them immediately, or would you have tried to handle it quietly first? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely want to hear where you draw the line between being a good neighbor and holding someone accountable. If you enjoyed this dramatized story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more community conflict stories, and share this one with someone who believes doing the right thing is rarely the easiest choice, but almost always the one worth making.